Typing in progress.
But now Western Czechoslovakia was surrounded by the new Greater Germany. Here were the industrial powerhouses of the Czech state, the factories and the mines. Here too were fortifications vital for Czech defense. The Czechs had an efficient, well-equipped army, but against the enemy within, they had few defenses. 3 million Germans lived in Czechoslovakia, mostly in the frontier area called the Sudetenland. Propaganda from the new German Reich across the border was increasing the dislike and contempt they felt for their Czech rulers. In April 1938, Konrad Henlein, leader of the Nazi-backed German Sudeten Party, demanded self-government for the Sudetenland. It was a cruel demand. The Czechs stood to lose not just the Germans, but their industrial strength and their defenses as well. The Czech president, Beneš, seemed to have the choice of hanging on to the Sudetenland at the risk of war with Germany, or...
It's 9 o'clock. I think I might have showed you this before, early on in the semester. The reason I'm showing this now is because this has come up again in discussions about the latest efforts to try to bring about an end to the war in Ukraine, and the question about ultimately comes back to what are the ultimate motivations for Russia's intervention? What are the ultimate foreign policy motivations for, notice I said Russia's intervention, I didn't say Putin's intervention, I didn't say the Vladimir Putin's decision, the ultimate foreign policy motivations for Russia's intervention in Ukraine. And this discussion about whether or not, this controversy, I should say, this debate about whether or not Russian motivations are offensive or defensive is really a critical part of the discussion currently underway about how to respond to Russian violent, deadly belligerency. Is Russia's violent, deadly belligerency due to the fact that it sees a wonderful opportunity, a marvelous opportunity to rebuild the old Soviet Union or the old Russian Empire? Presumably because Joe Biden is old, America is divided and weak with killings every day of students in schools, it seems, and They have China on their side as an ally, a big, powerful ally, and America is unstable, or is rather more so towards the fact, or the inference that Russian foreign policy motivation is due to a belief that, due to Russian perceptions that it's being surrounded encircled by NATO and America's allies within NATO, including the European Union, as a handmaiden, as a tool by which to, in the nuclear era, not conquer countries the way Adolf Hitler invaded Norway and France and Poland. No, 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 no. That's not how we do that in the nuclear era since 1945, because that could lead to suicide, right? So how would the American version of Nazi Germany, according to Vladimir Putin's worldview and this depiction of Putin's motivation as ultimate being defensive, what would the American version of Nazi Germany do? Basically, it tried to expand through indirect encirclement of the Soviet Union economically, culturally, socially, but particularly economically, through America's tremendous economic wealth, America's control, basically control of most of the Middle East and the oil sources there in Saudi Arabia and other countries, America's dominance of the global financial system, in which 88% of the world's financial transactions involving business are in what currency? Anais, what currency is used in 88% of world business transactions? The dollar, not the euro, the dollar, right? And this is interesting. Again, one of the reasons we have this great opportunity to teach as professors is because, you know, I sit in my office staring at my computer, thinking my own thoughts all day, 7 days a week. And then only when I teach do I get an opportunity to try to express what's going on up here explicitly. And so this sounds like how the Americans viewed, in fact, a mirror image, how the Americans viewed the Soviet Union expanding during the Cold War, on the assumption that the Soviet Union was a Russian version of Nazi Germany. But of course, since 1945, the Soviet Union, in this Cold Warrior worldview, the worldview that dominates in Washington to this day about what happened from 1948 to 2000 until 1992, during the Cold War, that this Russians version of Nazi Germany called the Soviet Union, of course, they know about the dangers of nuclear weapons, so they would try to expand their global empire and influence through their indirect methods, working through the spreading of socialism and communism, the workers taking control of the means of production while fighting European imperialism and racism, and working indirectly through their agents and spies. And this is something for me to think about. So thank you very much for being here to allow me to think through this, that this is a mirror image of the Cold War. That Russia and Moscow, if one believes that Putin is belligerent towards Ukraine because he sees this worldwide capitalist conspiracy driven from Washington, and disputes between Trump and Biden and Obama, that's all superficial, relatively minor superficial issue. But what's really important is the nature of American Anglo-Saxon-led capitalism. And the ruling circles in the business and financial banking circles that dominate the American economy and American society, they are thrusting forward, expanding the American influence economically, and of course, economically includes commercial culture, pop culture. Everybody's doing rap music. Everybody adopts American fashion. And it takes one step to think about adopting American ideas like LGBTQ rights, at least among the progressive elements of America. Wow. You know, that's something really to think about, because, you know, the Soviet Union, again, I'm an old man, so the Soviet Union, I remember during the Cold War, the Soviet propaganda coming out of Moscow during the Cold War talked in these terms, that there are ruling circles in Washington, and that's the term they used, ruling circles. It's not so much the president, that's important, but what's important is this hidden, vast economic infrastructure around oligarchical capitalism of the American variety, that this is pulling the strings and controlling American policy. And Putin still has that. First off, we all thought it was just a lie back in the Cold War time, that this is Soviet propaganda. They don't even really believe it themselves. No, they really did believe it, at least under the people that came to power from Stalin and afterwards, the first generation after Stalin. Stalin, and then Khrushchev, and Brezhnev, and then Yuri Andropov. He was a smart guy. He was a different kind of guy. He was the head of the KGB, and he was the one that selected Mikhail Gorbachev to replace him, identified him that this guy is an up-and-coming bright guy. This is the head of the KGB, mind you. He put Gorbachev in power, the guy that started Glasnost and Perestroika, that began the end of the Cold War. It was Andropov, the head of the Soviet secret police, that said, this guy, he's the future of our country. How does that fit with the Cold War stereotype of the Soviet Union being ineluctably evil, with the diabolical enemy stereotype? And this is what I write about, this is what I talk about, this is what I have to write about. I have to present a paper in a week and a half on this topic, what I presented here earlier a few weeks ago. But they really did believe that notion, that there's these powers pulling, in effect, almost pulling the strings, that it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's not insignificant, but Biden versus Trump, that's all minor issue in terms of what really is the deep thrust of capitalism directed from Washington and to a lesser extent London, that Stalin saw. And Putin was a creature of the KGB. He was one of the top police officials on the front line of the Cold War, based in East Germany, you know, where they were facing NATO. And so what are the sources of Russian today, of 2022, what are the sources of Russian violence? Why are they using deadly force? Are they trying to use deadly force to conquer the old Soviet Union and maybe finally take over all of Europe with a weak and disunited America, no longer willing to pay the price of its leadership in the world when it got defeated in Afghanistan? Or is Russia belligerent because it really sees this conspiracy theories of America being the evil empire? And these are patterns that human beings manifest, whether they're Russian or American or German or Chinese or Arab or Iranian. And that's, you know, a theme that I've been working on. But the point I wanted to highlight is that this is the current debate that is often implicit in these discussions about how do we respond to Moscow? What are we supposed to do with regard to Moscow to end this war in Ukraine? And just to show you some of the points that are coming up in the current media coverage that highlight these notions. So, for example, I got to remember to do the smart attendance. Here's a news article that came out yesterday. Of course, Volodymyr Zelensky, we mocked him because this former actor, he's now president of a country. He's never been an elected official, Volodymyr Zelensky. And now, since he's fighting Russia, he's America and the West's hero, Volodymyr Zelensky. What I wanted to highlight here is this is a report where Zelensky slams Henry Kissinger. Now, Henry Kissinger was a dominant American foreign policy official as National Security Advisor and then U.S. Secretary of State under Nixon and Ford administration. So from 1968 until 1976, he pretty much dominated American foreign policy making. And he's still alive. He's 98 years old, and whenever he says anything, the Western media, oh, what does Henry Kissinger have to say? And so Henry Kissinger evidently is calling upon Ukraine, and there you see Volodymyr Zelensky wearing his khaki t-shirt, warfare manual, masculine war fighting t-shirt that he always wears. And that Henry Kissinger suggested on Monday that Ukraine hand over territory to Russia to secure peace. Now, if you're making that argument that basically you can bring peace if you appease Russia by giving them control over some portion of Ukraine, That implies that Russian foreign policy motivation is ultimately defensive. In other words, it's this. Remember, we showed this a few weeks ago in class, right? It implies that this is why Russia is belligerent today, something like this. And this was the assumption of Neville Chamberlain and France's appeasement of Germany of Hitler in 1938. In terms of saying, okay, you can have the Sudetenland, you can take control of that territory because that belongs to Germany. It's the German people want to be safe and secure by living all together in one German state. And Czechoslovakia is a young, small state that was created in 1919. It's not even 20 years old. They don't like the Germans living in the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia feel oppressed and abused by the Czechs. Okay, so we'll appease. And the assumption is that Hitler, making his belligerent, nasty, assertive demands and threatening violence if necessary, was motivated by this, right? That the ultimate source of German foreign policy motivation was national dignity, national unity, national independence. And then lesser important, you can always, there's never one single motivation. That's an important point, right? But some are more important than others. So dignity, after being humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, saying Germany had to accept responsibility, pay all that money to France and Belgium and other countries for war reparations, and it lost 30% of its territory, and it wasn't allowed to have a real army, navy, or air force anymore. And so if you appease this, it will become a status quo power. It will stop talking about overthrowing the established order. And of course, this was grossly wrong. Instead, this was the foreign policy motivation of Hitler's Germany in 1938, that it was belligerent because it didn't see a threat trying to destroy Germany. It saw a marvelous opportunity by weak, decadent France, surrounded by weak, decadent countries, completely disorganized, whether that's Paris, Moscow, London. And so you're seeing a marvelous opportunity to establish Germany's dominance of Europe with Hitler, the leader of that new order, and the population getting really excited about that, with those euphoric, often spontaneous demonstrations of support for Der Fuhrer. And if you appease this, right, it's a disaster, because this actor has this foreign policy motivation because the prevailing view in the country is that it has a tremendously wonderful opportunity because it's surrounded by degenerate actors, that they're confused, nobody's in charge in Paris, nobody's in charge in London, nobody's really in charge in Moscow. They're disorganized to the point of confusion. They don't know what they want. They can't decide what they want. And of course, if you're my fellow citizen and you disagree with my portrayal of our adversaries as degenerate, then you probably degenerate yourself. You're one of the sources of sickness that make those countries weak and degenerate, and we need to cut you out like a tumor. And that includes Jews and liberals and intellectuals and anybody who disagrees with me. And so I showed you this before, and of course, this is the diabolical enemy stereotype that got America involved in Vietnam and Korea, and that's why we're all here today, because the Soviet Union was a Russian version of Nazi Germany, trying to conquer the world under the direction of Stalin, Mao Zedong, Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea, Ho Chi Minh, Salvador Allende, Fidel Castro, Patrice Lumumba. They're all working for Stalin. Oh, and let's not forget, Nelson Mandela. The CIA helped put him in jail and told the white authorities in South Africa where he was because of the belief that the CIA believed that Nelson Mandela, if he's not an agent of Moscow, he's a dupe, a fool, helping advance Russia's worldwide efforts at expansion in the Cold War nuclear era through indirect expansion with its allies and friends, working and taking orders secretly from Moscow. And so its motivation is simple. There's no complexity of politics. There's no politics in this country. This is like Mordor in Lord of the Rings. There is no politics in Mordor. There's the will of Sauron or the will of Stalin. Decisional style, highly rational to the point of being able to organize these worldwide communist conspiracy to take over the world through communism. And I mean, it's ridiculous. And of course, if you see this, Of course, what is the source of the power of the evil empire against the United States? Well, and of course, we, the Americans, we're a democracy. We have freedom of speech and freedom of the press and free elections, and we have a Congress with 2 houses of Congress that compete and argue with each other, and we have to vote. But Stalin or Sauron, they don't have to deal with all that. They just give an order, and the slave empire automatically implements this vast conspiracy to take over the world. And why am I mentioning this? Because the author, the person who trained me when I was a professor, who died, when he was a professor who died, what, 27 years ago, he came up with this theoretical framework called on image theory. And I, described how this was Hitler's worldview, or the prevailing view in Germany with Hitler being predominant, right? That these actors were degenerate, the allies were Japan and Italy, colonial, these countries were waiting to be taken over by somebody because they're inferior in capability and culture. And these are countries that are equal in culture to Germany and France, but they're proxies being exploited by, or not exploited, but controlled by these degenerate great powers. Norway, Belgium, Denmark, Netherlands. And this is from my mentor, and then I expanded this to this. This is what Putin, I think, sees. That he sees the USA as enemy. He does see some complexity in the United States political system, but not as much as he might see, for example, in Republic of Korea or Saudi Arabia. And this is Russia's prevailing view when it invaded Ukraine. And it's enemy, not degenerate, it's enemy. And NATO, European Union are proxies of this enemy. And Ukraine and Georgia are tools or proxies of NATO and Europe, ultimately serving USA. So Putin does see a derivative opportunity to assert Russia's great power equivalence with the United States by intervening in these 2 countries. So he does see these 2 countries as degenerate. And remember, stereotypes are wrong. It's a human predisposition to engage in stereotyping, but they're wrong. And so he invaded Ukraine, or at least the prevailing view was in Moscow, that we'll send the Russian army and we'll take Kiev in a few days, and the Ukrainian people will love us. And obviously that was grossly wrong. That's a product of stereotyping. You don't see Ukrainian nationalism the way, for example, the Americans didn't see Vietnamese nationalism. When you see the world defined versus in terms of good versus evil, us versus the diabolical enemy, then the world becomes seen in those 2 good versus evil framework. Like there's the forces of heaven versus the forces of hell. And you don't see third actors independent from both. You don't see Vietnamese nationalism. You don't see Korean nationalism. You don't see Cuban nationalism. You don't see African nationalism. You don't see Iranian nationalism. And that leads to disasters, like America being defeated in Vietnam. The way America saw an opportunity to fix, we're going to fix Vietnam, the way Putin's going to fix Ukraine. And obviously, we were both wrong. So, but the point I wanted to highlight in terms of what's interesting today in today's news report, again, you have to be careful about how you respond to, I argue that, what happened here? Just a second. Am I still, you're still recording, right? Yeah, okay. Back to the, back to this, come on. What's it doing now? It froze. Okay, well, I don't have to. So that's the question, just to conclude, that I think that this is Russia's foreign policy motivation. It's not like Hitler Germany in 1938. It's more like the assumptions of the appeasement strategy that were wrong, because this wasn't Germany's foreign policy motivation in 1938. But Russia's foreign policy motivation, I think, is more in accordance with the appeasement strategy. So that implies that there needs to be some kind of accommodation with Russia, right? National dignity. Putin's motivation is, I keep saying Putin, I shouldn't do that, but it's easy to say, it's just easy to say. Russia's foreign policy motivations are dignity and unity, national dignity, national unity, irredentism, then survival of the regime, survival of Putin's regime, and so on. So this, you could make the argument that appeasement or compromise with Russia is necessary if you want to keep this from escalating. If Russia sees the West as basically a diabolical enemy, and the diabolical enemy then decides it wants to overthrow Putin's regime, then this could lead to escalation. In some, I mean, that's why some actors who know about this, that are talking about this in Washington and elsewhere, that Putin might use nuclear weapons if he gets desperate, right? What does that mean? They don't know really how. I mean, he might blow up a bomb over the Black Sea or somewhere in Ukraine, you know, just to demonstrate. But again, the ultimate signal is being sent to the West. It's being sent to Washington in doing that, not Ukraine, Washington. And and so it's interesting that basically the conflict that we might portray what's going on today, you know, that this was the system that produced, if I can find it here, it was, why wasn't this thing, it's acting strangely, that this was the Cold War. Of course, this is my view, but many people in the US disagree. No. Russia saw opportunity. It wasn't defensive, didn't see threat, it saw opportunity. T for threat, O for opportunity. And that this is what Germany saw in 1938. And to see opportunity, you have to see your great power adversaries as degenerate. It's hard for me to believe that Russia wants to conquer all of the old Soviet Union. Its entire economy is the size of South Korea's economy. It's about the same size economy as Texas, the state of Texas in the United States. How can such a country, in terms of its ruling elite, believe that it can dominate Europe? So again, just to go on here, just to show you the danger of the situation that we're in, is this is the system that produced World War I. Austria-Hungary saw opportunity towards Serbia, arguably like how Moscow sees opportunity today towards Ukraine when it invaded, to beat up Ukraine or beat up Serbia, to show UK, France, and Germany and Russia that Austria-Hungary is a number one, not a number two power, a number one power. Restore the empire, beat up Serbia after they offended us by killing the Archduke, the person that was supposed to be the next emperor, through an assassination plot in Sarajevo, organized with Serbian secret police help in Belgrade. And we'll beat the crap out of those Serbs, and everybody's going to take us seriously again. And this produced World War I. So that's, but the point I wanted to get to in terms of how it relates to today's class, you can say, so here you see Kissinger is suggesting that Ukraine has to hand over some territory to Russia to secure peace. To make that argument, you have to be assuming, even if you don't realize it, that Russia's foreign policy motivations are heavily defensive. And not against Ukraine, defensive against the United States, with Ukraine being seen as a little proxy puppet tool. And this guy here is a proxy puppet tool of the Americans, working through the European Union. And he says, you're wrong, disagrees completely. He says here, he's attacking Henry Kissinger's suggestion, criticized Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, criticized former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger for saying Ukraine should hand over territory to Russia in exchange for peace. He's saying, you can't do that. That's not going to make them peaceful. It'll make them more aggressive. Like it made Germany more aggressive when they got the Sudetenland. You're not going to make peace in Europe that way. You're going to make war more likely. The way appeasement of Germany made Hitler's worldview that he was explaining to his competitors in Germany, these actors, Paris, London, they're pushovers. They don't know what they want, and they will back down. They're paper tigers. They cannot resist this. Aha, I was right. They gave us the Sudetenland. So you listen to me. I am right. And he became even more powerful because he looked like he was a genius, a political genius in Berlin. So if you think he's arguing that basically Russian foreign policy is aggressive, that Russia sees opportunity, and that if you hand over territory, of course it's his country, he doesn't want his country to be parceled up, divided up. And so what does he say here? He says, speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos on Monday, Kissinger said Ukraine should return to the status quo ante, a Latin phrase meaning how things were before. Before what, we don't know. By that, before 2014 or before 2022. By that, Kissinger implied that Ukraine should let Russia control Crimea, the peninsula annexed in 2014, as well as informally rule the Donbass region through the pro-Kremlin factions that have occupied the region since 2014. I gotta make sure you can see this. I'm always nervous if this is not really sharing screen, even though it says it is. So in an address on Wednesday to Davos, Zelensky derided Kissinger for a suggestion saying the nonagenarian, the 90-plus guy, was emerging from the deep past. It seems that Mr. Kissinger's calendar is not 2022, but 1938. And he thought he was talking to an audience not in Davos, but in Munich of that time, because it was at Munich that Chamberlain, British Prime Minister Chamberlain in France agreed to appease Hitler and let them take the Sudetenland. And he goes on here, the appeasement of the Nazi Third Reich in Germany. By the way, in the year 1938, what is wrong with this? It's not even allowing me. Okay. By the way, in 1938, when Kissinger family was fleeing Nazi Germany, he was 15 years old and he understood everything perfectly. And nobody heard from him then that it was necessary to adapt to the Nazis instead of fleeing them or fighting them. It's interesting, by the way, in the same way that also pop culture does influence current rhetoric. When you have the right theoretical framework, the entire world becomes a learning experience. So at least 3 times, just reading the Western press or listening to radio from America on my cell phone, the Ukrainians call the Russian troops orcs. Mordor, orcs, the soldiers of Mordor, the monsters. They even view, of course, the Soviet Moscow and Russia as an evil empire. So it goes on here. In the same address, Zelensky also criticized New York Times for a May 19 article published by its editorial board, which said the U.S. should avoid engaging with the conflict given that the domestic inflation was a more pressing issue. So symptomatic editorials begin to appear in some Western media stating that Ukraine must allegedly accept so-called difficult compromises by giving up territory in exchange for peace. Perhaps New York Times in 1938 also wrote something similar, but now let me remind you, it's 2022. So here he is, 98 years old. This is a very controversial guy, all right? So I showed you that about PowerPoint presentation and this, of course, the enemy stereotype. So my professor, Richard Cotton, who, as I told you, he died in 1997, he went to graduate school with Henry Kissinger. They were at Harvard together, along with Zbigniew Brzezinski, another well-known political scientist during the Cold War era, who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor when he came in as president in 1976. And Samuel Huntington, the Clash of Civilizations thesis, they all went to graduate school together at Harvard. And he had lots of interesting stories to tell about Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was a guy who was driven by a deep desire to rise in status and influence in American society. He described Henry Kissinger as, in terms of his theoretical framework, he described Henry Kissinger as a person whose primary definition or understanding of achievement as it relates to him. And here you can see, these are my notes from my professor from 25 years ago, Brzezinski, Vance, that Henry Kissinger motivation in terms of achievement. Remember, what's the essence of modernity? The shift from ascription to achievement is the basis of status in society. So let me just read this. He said his understanding of achievement in this world is role. This man loves power. His role apparently determines his position. So achievement, in terms of doing something in this world, to feel like you're worthwhile means occupying positions of power and authority. And he had all these strange stories. Like, for example, as I said, he went to graduate school at Harvard with, with Brzezinski and Huntington and Kissinger. And he said Kissinger would never share ideas. Like, they would get together and talk. And remember, they have to write papers for their professors. And so sometimes they would get ideas from talking with their colleagues and say, and write a good paper. He would never share his ideas. He wouldn't, and he was married. And he always had his wife walk behind him. Whenever he was walking, they were walking together, his wife always walked behind him. And then, he was a graduate student at Harvard, and he had an office. He had an office at Harvard, and he used to teach classes. And go into his office, he said, he would see all these marks on the wall from where he would get so infuriated or angry about something, Henry Kissinger would evidently take off his shoes and go, "Argh!" and throw it at the wall. Not around other people. He'd go into his office. So he didn't have a high estimation of Henry Kissinger's ultimate personal values and motivation. Then he dumped his wife and married some glamorous woman who belonged to an aristocratic political family in Pennsylvania. A woman in the Clark family. The Clark family is like an aristocratic family in Pennsylvania, the way the Kennedys are in Massachusetts, and the way the Tafts are in Ohio, and the Bushes are in Texas. And but the point I wanted to get to is that my professor told me that he got the model for the diabolical enemy stereotype from Henry Kissinger's book that made him well known and famous, and that is this book, Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy from 1957. That this was the book that made the Washington power elite aware of this man, Henry Kissinger. And the Cold Warriors, who viewed the Soviet Union as a diabolical enemy, they described this book as brilliant, including John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State at one point for Eisenhower, when President Eisenhower was president from 1953 until 1960. He called this brilliant. And he describes the conflict or challenge or problem that the United States and its allies faces in terms of the Soviet Union, is the Soviet Union being a diabolical enemy. That's where Cottam said he got the diabolical enemy image elements from this book. And then where did he get the degenerate stereotype image from? That he got the degenerate stereotype image from Mein Kampf. Hitler was very open about what he planned to do when he came to power, and this is not really working. So maybe if I can go just type in Mein Kampf, and I think I might have showed you this before, but I'll just go back here to. Or is it blocking me? Sometimes I wonder. Amazon does strange things at times. These books become controversial, so they don't want to show them. Because somebody complained about, promoting nasty ideas. But at the same time, of course, so there's my professor said he got they've changed this. Is that the original? That might be the original copy when it was first published, right? My Struggle. That the elements of the degenerate stereotype are outlined in that book, in his book, in Hitler's book. That he has this plan, this strategy, this Lebensraum strategy, and why could he do it? Why could it be implemented? Because the French and the British and the Soviets, they're just completely disorganized, and with their in the case of the U.S. and in France and London with their bourgeois democracy, and Stalin's killing everybody who he thinks he's as an enemy by the millions. We have a marvelous opportunity if we have the will and determination to act. And so whenever you hear a politician talk about will and determination and resolve, that's evidence of a dysfunctionality, because they're stereotyping. We must show the Russians we have the resolve to resist them. And remember, the opposite of stereotyping is seeing complexity in the policymaking process of your target. And we talked about that in the previous class, right? Somebody who sees complexity, this thing's not, something's going on here. I don't know what I did, but somebody who sees complexity, you know, is this. Somebody who sees complexity, who's not stereotyping, describes that there's different motivations, constituencies at work in Moscow or Berlin or Washington or Moscow or Beijing or Pyongyang, that the leadership is trying to coordinate, that Vladimir Putin and his group are trying to coordinate a large number of competing functional organizations. It's not just the will of Putin. What does Putin want? Putin's plan. Putin. Remember that levels of analysis, individual level of analysis is obviously critically important, but that's never sufficient to explain why Russia invaded Ukraine. Decisional style of targets incremental with decision makers immersed in details. And I just get a sense that there's all this fluidity. There's a lot of fluidity in Moscow right now. Moscow doesn't act like Hitler's Germany. They're not fully mobilized to fight the war in Ukraine. They're not acting like Nazi Germany in 1938, 1939. We know how an intensely aggressive imperialist great power acts. Look at Germany in 1939. There you got the model, the closest in reality to the ideal typical image. There it is. And Russia today is not acting like that. And so, but of course, this is the source of this controversy, this discussion about what are the sources of foreign Russian belligerency. And of course, so you see Zelensky's arguing, no, if you appease them, they're just going to become even more aggressive. And he's not the only one saying that. For example, here is the Prime Minister of Estonia saying, no, you cannot appease, they cannot win, they cannot get any benefits, they cannot get any territory out of this adventure. So peace cannot be the ultimate goal. Prime Minister Kaja Kallas of Estonia told the New York Times, I only see a solution as a military victory that could end this once and for all, and also punishing the aggressor for what he has done. Otherwise, she said, we go back to where we started. You have a pause of 2 years, and then everything will continue. In other words, you can't let him win in Ukraine. You can't give him any territory, because if you do, you appease him, and we'll make the same mistake we made in 1938-39. And she's making that claim, again, in 2014, the previous leader of Estonia said the same thing when Russia occupied Crimea. And they said, well, yeah, we're right. We let him get away with taking Crimea and part of Luhansk and Donetsk. And he thought, well, I got that, and now I'll go for the rest of it. You let him get that away, and you didn't punish him enough. Russia wasn't punished enough for taking Crimea. So the point is, this is how you use this theoretical framework that I've been using, trying to understand what are we disagreeing about here. I mean, when Kissinger, and remember Kissinger, he says whatever he thinks he has to say to be relevant, because that's who he is. His argument assumes that Russia's belligerency is not due to a desire to conquer the Eurasian landmass. And in other words, they see a threat, and they're stereotyping apparently some combination of historical legacy threats from that they've inherited from the coercive control structures of the Soviet Union that still exist. I mean, the ruling clique that rules in Moscow, the term for them, the general term is siloviki. The sila is the Slavic or Russian for force. So silovik is somebody who worked in the forces. So siloviki is the plural for the forces. All of these people at the top, they're old KGB people, or under the other secret police organizations and military and security organizations created during the Soviet times. And that's where the Soviet worldview that Stalin first articulated was most institutionalized. And you might say, this is crazy. I know it's crazy, but this isn't the least of crazy. I mean, those people in Syria or in the Middle East, they have these incredible conspiracy theories. And they really believe them and believe that the person that's opposing me is serving Zionist, American, Saudi imperialist, and they should die. This isn't something that typically Europeans or Americans have much experience with, but outside of the US and Europe, conspiratorial stereotype-based thinking is very, very prominent. You even see it in Italy, where I had relatives. Because there was, and of course you saw it in Greece as well, because these countries that have been subject to internal interference in their political evolution by the CIA and other forces, they become a little bit crazy. They see conspiratorial elements everywhere, and they engage in so-called what we call terrorism. These militant radical revolutionary groups within Italy or Greece, N17 in Greece, or the Red Brigades in Italy in the 1970s. So before I forget, let's go back to the smart attendance here. And your attendance number is 139. Put that in the chat box, 139. Okay, so that's your attendance number, 139. And, okay, so let's go back then to the notes. And again, it's just very unfortunate that the European Union is perceived in Moscow as part of the American conspiracy to dominate Eurasia in the world. And that's a problem if you really value the European Union as a peace strategy. And I think that there's some elements of that in Paris. So Paris has always been a little bit more resistant to American influence in the European Union, but they've not really, since de Gaulle, they've really sort of come back. I mean, particularly when the Cold War ended, when France came back into NATO, so Macron attempts to talk about distancing the European Union from the United States and NATO, but they don't have support from Germany. And German-French cooperation is the foundation of European integration and Europeanization. And but back to the notes for subnational authorities. Yeah, so I want to see here, what else do I want to talk about? Okay, so maybe this is not really highlighted here, maybe in this book, but these this cohesion and cohesion policies in terms of regional and economic development policy supported by the European Union. This was first adopted in responding to pressures from Italy. That, of course, Italy is a country that is characterized by wealth and poverty. And the poverty tends to be concentrated in what is called the Mezzogiorno, or southern Italy. And so if I go to the notes here and click on southern Italy on Wikipedia, you can see a region, and Mezzogiorno is the term for it. And so this area is where poverty is traditionally concentrated. It's also the area that is, of course, stereotyped as in popular culture as the homeland of the mafia, the Cosa Nostra, with Sicily here in Palermo and in Naples, this was the area that was first developed as a region, or focused on as a region, as what's today the European Union moved towards adopting policies to develop the poorer regions of the member states. And so there, here you see a reference that you saw in the notes. The NUTS, let's click on this, the European Union is referenced in your reading for this week. It says here, the classification of territorial units for statistics for NUTS for the French nomenclature de unités territoriales statistiques is a geocode standard for referencing the administrative divisions of countries for statistical purposes. The standard was developed by the European Union. So you see there's a reference to that in the book. And so A1, I guess the poorer regions of Austria are here. And I guess these, I assume that it is characterized in terms of the prosperity, relative prosperity of the different regions. So this Eastern Europe would tend to be the poorer regions, but you can see that all of Europe is divided up in this way into regions. So, and then of course you're reading a bit about Spain, because Spain has the most developed regional policy. And so I just wanted to show you that there is a website for this, but this policy was first developed to deal with Italy. And it was about the same time, I believe, as the Common Agricultural Policy was being formalized, that the Italian government pushed also for money from the European, what was then the European Community, to help develop this desperately poor area, relatively speaking, desperately poor area of Italy. And that was the foundation for the creation of structural cohesion policies, and that you're reading about this week. And so yeah, it says here, subnational authorities, the NUTS classification divides the European Union into territorial units. Its purpose is to collect statistics, make socioeconomic analyses, and develop regional policies. Cultural, linguistic, and oh, I gotta make sure you can see that. I forgot to share the screen. So cultural, linguistic, and ethnic regions can also be followed with this system, even though the NUTS system has its base in economic parameters. So NUTS 1 focuses on major socioeconomic regions, NUTS 2 focuses on basic regions for the application of regional policies, and NUTS 3 focuses on small regions for specific policy diagnoses. So as the European community expanded and then became the European Union, of course, a lot of other countries came into the European Union that were also relatively poor, like Greece, like Portugal, like Spain, and then later the former communist countries. So this regional structural and cohesion policy framework that was developed originally for Italy was then expanded and extended outward to the other new countries that were coming in, not so much Finland, which was prosperous, or Austria, which was prosperous, or in the mid-1990s, when the prosperous countries of Sweden, Finland, and Austria joined the European Union. But in particular, when the poor countries joined, like early in the 1980s with Greece and Portugal and Spain, and then in the first decade of the 21st century, when the former communist countries joined. And this is, of course, moved a lot of the money that the Italians were used to expecting to receive for Italy. And then later, the Spanish were expecting to continue to receive for Spain and Portugal, then was then shifted to Hungary, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria. And of course, nobody likes to lose something that they have. So if Spain, in order to get Spain to acquiesce to getting less money for regional development in poor regions of Spain, you have to give something else to Spain. And that's the essence of European policymaking, that everybody gets something. If you're going to ask somebody to give something up, including Italy to give up regional funds for the Mezzogiorno, or Spain to give up money so it can go to Poland or Bulgaria, then you have to give something else to Italy and Spain. And often that will involve developing new policies of the European Union to provide these new benefits or new opportunities for these countries that are acquiescing to the loss of the money that they were receiving under the European Union's regional policy, structure and cohesion policies. And that includes, for example, there's discussion in the book about how Spain was given more votes, I believe, in the Council of the European Union, that when they had to reorganize the voting system to incorporate all those new countries coming in the former communist countries of Eastern Europe, that they had to change the voting weights in the Council of Ministers of the European Union. And Spain got some compensation there, or they might get more votes in the European Parliament, more seats in the European Parliament, but something has to be given to compensate for expanding these policies to the expanding regions of the European Union that typically are poorer than the existing members of the European Union. Europeanization of policies has its essential focus determining to what extent and how Europeanization has instigated change in the policies of the member states. Yeah, I mean, that's what we're focused on. How has Europeanization really changed the way the Italians do things? Is Italy less corrupt? Is the mafia less influential? I mean, at one point I remember reading, at least 20 years ago, that like up to 5% of the gross national product of Italy, the gross domestic product of Italy, was somehow involved or controlled by the mafia. Is that reduced since Europeanization has come about? And it's a big topic to go into, but I just wanted to show you that news report that came out in the New York Times yesterday about how Palermo in Sicily, you know, where the Corleone family and the Godfather came from, supposedly, Sicily has changed, that Sicily has become an attractive city to tourists. I mean, I remember telling my aunt, I wanted to go see my aunt in Rome. I wanted to go, I've never been to Naples. I've never been to Southern Italy. She said, oh, you can't go. It's beautiful, but you can't go. You'll get, bad things will happen to you there. It's so dangerous there. This is not focusing upon the subnational authority policy of the European Union or the structural cohesion policy. It's talking about an art exhibit in Sicily, in Palermo, Sicily. It says here, until recently, the city was infamous as one of the world's organized crime capitals. Warring mobsters gunned down rivals in the streets and built up ugly high-rise apartments with public funds, while much of the historic center was left to crumble. And that's a concern, right? That much of this money that the European Union is giving to Italy or Bulgaria is somehow being stolen. Particularly since the European Union its bureaucracy is not big. The whole bureaucracy of the European Union is about the same size as the city government of Paris. How are they going to monitor 27 member states to make sure that they're not doing corrupt things with the money that they're getting through the structural and cohesion policies and the common agricultural policy of the European Union? They try, and they work with NGOs in Bulgaria and in Poland and Hungary to provide news gathering, data gathering, and information, but still they're small. There's a court of auditors. There's an audit branch of the European Union called the Court of Auditors. But still, the point is, this European Union relies overwhelmingly upon the bureaucracies of the member states to make Europeanization happen. It relies upon the Italian state and bureaucracy, the German state and bureaucracy, the member states and their government apparatuses. Their government bureaucracies are overwhelmingly important in implementing what the European Union decides to do, including trying to make sure that, that money is not stolen from European Union policies. And so it goes on here. Palermo authorities have since managed to clamp down on the mafia, and the city's capital feels like a different place today. Anti-mafia protesters are a common sight on the fronts of buildings, and the streets now throb with tourists. Palermo's bounce back is fragile, and many remain wary that the mafia could stage a comeback. A key point in Palermo's turnaround was the murder of Giovanni Falcone, a judge who pioneered new methods to combat mafia influence and paved the way for the restoration of law and order. The mafia had its revenge in 1992, killing Falcone in a bombing that horrified residents and united them against the mob. So, you know, I finished my dissertation about this time, so of course I was well aware and was watching this go on. And so to mark the 30th anniversary of Falcone's murder, Palermo on Monday unveiled a series of art installations reminding people of the city's grim mafia years and encouraging local residents to resist creeping organized crime influence. So I should tell you today that the area around Naples and that area, Apulia, is more of a problem with regard to, and Calabria is more of a problem with regard to the mafia than Sicily is. The name for the mafia in Calabria is the Ndregata, and they're more have more influence, it seems, in Italian and European and global smuggling and criminal activities than Sicily does. The reason I mention Sicily is because when I mention Sicily and Palermo, all Americans at least think about The Godfather, the film The Godfather from 1971 that was focused on Sicily. But actually Sicily's done pretty well. And of course, the member states of the European Union cooperate with each other. The police forces, the investigative forces cooperate to try to share information because of the involvement of these mafia organizations in smuggling, illegal economic activities, smuggling drugs, human trafficking, and money laundering. And I remember when he was killed, even the FBI got involved. The FBI sent an investigative team over to investigate his killing, and his successor was also killed. This man, Paolo Borsellino, another magistrate who was killed by the mafia about the same time, soon after Falcone, and it goes on to describe how they put on trial like 300. Yeah, here it is. This is talking about how local corrupt officials would use government money to build housing for people, for example, to steal some of it, to undermine its purpose. And but just to go on here, Falcone helped liberate Palermo from the mafia by collaborating with turncoats, investigating bank accounts, and sharing information across borders. And that's what the European Union is all about, sharing information across borders, right? His findings culminated in an epic trial, resulting in more than 300 guilty verdicts in 1987. When mobsters slaughtered the judge in revenge, Palermo reeled in horror. There were huge protests throughout the city, and many residents hung white sheets displaying anti-mafia messages from their balconies. So this process of changing the attitudes and norms of local people is a slow and involved process, and European integration has played an important role in collaboration among the member states in their security and police organizations to support this process. Okay, so all right, so back to the notes. Make sure you can see this. Look here. Yeah, I mean, the most impressive impact of Europeanization, for example, has been in creating and implementing environmental protection policy. Europeanization of policies has its essential focus determining to what extent and how Europeanization has instigated change in the policies of the member states. Okay, I think I already covered that. Compliance and implementation studies has been a major focus of European Union research on subnational authorities. It focuses on how the central national authorities deal with European Union legislation. In several member states, subnational authorities have become critical players in the process of implementing EU policies. Decentralization of governance has led to subnational authorities becoming competent, that is, being legally responsible for a number of policy areas, including social and environmental legislation. And substantial variation exists in regional involvement. Subnational authorities are more involved in some policy sectors than in others, especially in environment, public procurement, and social policy. Subnational authorities are more engaged in more decentralized states, like Germany. Within more decentralized states, considerable differences in subnational authority involvement are evident. And so national implementation processes for EU legislation are the biggest focus on subnational authorities. Subnational authorities often play a role as potential vetoers in that they are understood to be able to affect the implementation of EU policies in these decentralized or federal member states. So in cases of mediocre implementation record, the cause has been labeled as largely due to the world of domestic politics, including intergovernmental relations within the member state. And so Bersens argues here that our research has shown that federal state structure is one variable that can explain late or incorrect national transposition of EU directives. So transposition is the term that refers to transposing what Brussels decides through typically the ordinary procedure in which the European Commission proposes new legislation, and then the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers debate, amend, and attempt to ratify it, and that a directive is adopted, and guess what? The member states, including their subnational authorities, they've got to implement it. And again, it's not that big of an organization. The European Union only has about 40,000 people that work for it, which is, like I said, about the same size as the city government of Paris. So some research shows other causes of ineffective implementation of EU policies due to regional unwillingness and because of perceived lack of involvement in formulating the EU policy. So in other words, if you had more active subnational authority activity in Brussels, like some of these German states, they pay for and have an office in Brussels to lobby and communicate with the Commission, with the European Parliament, but most don't. Domestic procedures do not fit well with European Union requirements, and a misfit exists between domestic and European Union policy instruments. Regional policies are relevant regarding Europeanization in that research has shown that a national government has designed its own regional policies in such a way that they will be more attractive to the EU as co-financing instruments for the EU structural funds. Yeah, the structure and cohesion funds. So that's a significant incentive to create strong, significant regional governments. That was, for example, the case in Bulgaria, right? Or these former communist countries. Under these totalitarian communist states, the central government controls things, right? So now Bulgaria is no longer communist and it wants to join the European Union. And so the European Union insists that Bulgaria create significant, substantive regional governments in Bulgaria. They don't have a tradition of this in Bulgaria. So they try to satisfy the European Union and they create structures. They divide up Bulgaria, and it was 21 administrative districts. It used to be like 6 under communism. Under the People's Republic of Bulgaria, there were 6 big administrative districts. Then under the pressure from the European structures, they divided up Bulgaria into 21 or 22. And of course, Bulgaria, like many of these countries in Eastern Europe, they have big minorities, large national ethnic minorities, Bulgarian Turks and Muslims. And the Bulgarians are obsessed or concerned that the Bulgarian Turks might want to break away their territory in Bulgaria and join it to Turkey. And so they first agreed that they would let those 21 or 22 districts of Bulgaria have direct elections for their governors. And then I think the Bulgarian government agreed, and then they changed their mind and they insist, no, we will appoint each of the governor in each of those new districts. And the European Union says, well, you shouldn't really do this. No. So they exist on paper, these regions, these districts. But if there's not a long, strong tradition, like in Germany, of strong regional governments with strong regional identity, like there is in Germany with the states, the European Union wanting Bulgaria and Poland and Greece and so on to copy those models, they will move in some direction to do that, like creating these structures so that they can actually figure out how to allocate the money and monitor the application of the structural funds. But their significance is still overwhelmingly determined by their own national history and attitudes and worldviews rather than what Brussels wants. Show you, right? I think, do I have it here? I thought maybe I have a lot of other stuff here, but I don't know if I have the Bulgaria. oh yeah, here's the Bulgaria file. So for example, this shows you Bulgaria, and it should have a map of how Bulgaria is divided up into. This is Great Bulgaria. This is what the Bulgarian nationalists claim. All this territory belongs to Bulgaria, and it was taken away from us by those bad Greeks and Serbs. And Bulgaria, of course, modern Bulgaria is only about, doesn't have this territory. Do they have? Okay, yeah, here, so what do they have? 27 districts. And these were created after communism. This is not something that was traditional in Bulgaria. And the Bulgarian Turkish population, of course, is concentrated here along the border with Turkey, and I think some up here as well. And they have been very, yeah, Bulgaria is a highly centralized state where the Council of Ministers directly appoints regional governors. We're not going to let them elect their governors because they're concerned that they're going to elect the Turkish nationalists will come to power and they'll break up Bulgaria the way Yugoslavia broke up. But again, you know, Bulgaria views this territory as Bulgarian the way Russia views Ukraine. But of course, Bulgaria is much weaker than Russia. And even though they tried repeatedly in the first half of the 20th century to take this territory back, they failed. I think I read one estimate that there were the First and Second Balkan War were right on the eve of World War I. And then Bulgaria was involved in those, and then in World War I, trying to get this territory back, allying with the Germans in World War I because the Serbs and the Greeks were allied with the French. And I read one source that said that up to 1/4 of the military age population of Bulgaria died from 1912 to 1918, fighting those wars to get back what the Bulgarians call their nationalite ideali, their national ideals. In other words, Bulgarian irredentism, to reunify these quote unquote Bulgarian lands that were stolen by Serbia and Greece. And he is the father of the man who was now, well, he was Prime Minister of Bulgaria from 2001 to 2005. Saxe-Coburg from one of the famous families of Europe. And, but okay, back to I mean, just to tell you that each country has their unique histories and attitudes towards subnational authorities. And they have more or less varying degrees of anxiety. Like, we don't want our subnational authorities to have too much power in Bulgaria. In Spain, it was part of the peace agreement to try to end the so-called terrorist struggles against the Franco regime after Franco died in 1975. But they're not going into all those unique, idiosyncratic worldviews and attitudes of Spain and Bulgaria and Poland. They're not doing that in this chapter. But they do sort of imply that if there was a history, history is more important than what the European Union wants in terms of encouraging more political participation by the public in formats so that I stop thinking myself as only a citizen of Bulgaria, a citizen of Poland, a citizen of France. I'm also a citizen of my town, of my city, of my region, and stop focusing so much on the all-powerful, all-important nation state that has given us so much tragedy and conflict in Europe. Yeah, so the national government does not simply succumb to adaptation pressures that the European Union puts on them, but rather plays an instrumental role in shaping development so that the impact of the European Union should not be overstated. Intervening domestic factors explain the differences among the EU member states in responding to Europeanization in terms of their subnational authorities, namely regional administrative capacity and the institutional complexities of their respective federal systems. So that's been a big problem for Bulgaria. Countries that have high levels of corruption, they have weak administrative capacity. The public officials are, if they have a problem with corruption, you're not able to implement your policies very effectively. And it's not just the former communist countries. Greece is like that as well, right? Greece, despite being in the European and NATO structures, European Union since the 1980s is, well, we saw how ineffective the administrative capacity of the Greek state is. They couldn't even report accurate information about the size of their government budget deficit until the financial crisis and the international investors became highly skeptical about what the Greek civil servants and the Greek government were telling. Even the Greek prime minister didn't know how bad it was until the worldwide investor community said, this is a house of cards, this thing called Greece. So, and again, you know, Greece has been in the European Union for 40 years. So it's difficult to change. I hate this term political culture, but it's easy to use. So the Europeanization of subnational authorities, the EU impact on regional actors, institutions, and intergovernmental relations. We investigate whether or how the EU alters the strategies and preferences of domestic regional political actors. We investigate whether the European Union instigates alterations in the member states' regional institutional settings and decision-making systems. Okay, so European Union policy coordination. European Union policy coordination is a well-documented dimension of Europeanization's impact on subnational authorities. European integration has not only transferred policy competencies from the EU member states to the European Union, but also from the regional level to the member states to the European Union. But also from the regional level of the member states to the European Union. So strong regions consequently had more to lose in comparison with weak regions. So in other words, like for example, in Germany, the regional governments are responsible for social and welfare policy. And if the European Union, as the European Union becomes more influential in trying to harmonize the taxation policies and social welfare policies of the member states to create a true single market, in the real substantive meaning of the term, it's in effect been requiring or pushing the regions to pay more attention to Brussels in carrying out their activity. And so that's had some impact on the legislative power on subnational authorities, but there had to already have been a tradition of strong subnational authorities in those countries. Strong regions already had a powerful position within the respective member states' constitutional order before European integration, so they often had the capability to react by becoming influential domestic players in the coordination of EU policies. So the most prominent examples are Austrian and Germany's Länder, as well as Belgian regions and communities, but also Spanish autonomous communities, and some British devolved authorities have been able to gain access to domestic EU policymaking, albeit to a lesser extent. So Spain is divided into communities. Some communities, like Catalonia, are more developed and more regionally focused than others. So there's differences within the member states themselves. Regional involvement in EU policymaking can also change over time. For example, in Spain, regional participation and cooperation in EU policymaking increased until the financial and sovereign debt crisis occurred. So typically, that meant that the central government had to step in and take over banks. And that meant, of course, the national governments becoming more important and powerful. So a variety of participation modes of regional participation in the domestic formulation of European Union policies emerges from the evidence. Okay, so The Europeanization of intergovernmental relations within member states has emphasized the impact of European Union membership in European Union regional policies in the form of proliferation of actors, both vertically and horizontally, within each member state involved in the domestic decision making. So elected, democratically legitimated national level actors no longer solely run national regional policies. Increasingly, regional actors, particularly in federal states, along with bureaucratic actors such as agencies and administrations, play an important role, as well as private actors, that's interest groups, and semi-private actors like experts and think tanks. And the gatekeeping role and policy autonomy of the central government has weakened because of European partnership principle triggering growing participation of semi-public and subnational actors in the European policy process. So again, this is supposed to be part of a peace strategy for Europe. And evidently, Moscow was not persuaded that if Ukraine joined the European Union, that Russian interests and Russian minority interests in Ukraine would be protected. They might even deny that there is such a thing as Ukrainian identity. Or if it was a minor, weak identity. Again, in that stereotype, because they were grossly wrong. How do we know they're wrong? They can't win. And you know, I was wrong myself. You know, I thought Ukraine would not resist heavily because the United States, like London and Paris in 1938, said, we're not going to fight in that war for Ukraine. We're not going to fight for you. So, and I thought, well, Ukraine should therefore back down, and they haven't. Ukraine is a nation, and it is one of the bigger nations of Europe, and we're seeing that cruelly and brutally demonstrated on the battlefield. These people are motivated. They will die for Ukraine, even if America and Paris and France and Germany are not going to send in their soldiers to help them. If you give them weapons, they'll use them, and they'll fight until they get killed. And we're seeing that. So if there's going to be a peace settlement in Ukraine, somehow regional autonomy and devolution of authority in Ukraine somehow has to play some kind of role in some kind of peace formula for Ukraine. If we're not going to simply result in a partition of Ukraine, which unfortunately seems more and more likely. They're going to partition this country on the battlefield into two parts, a Ukrainian part and a part that belongs to Russia. And that's horrible, but that looks like where it's escalating towards. And you know, as America continues to provide more and more weapons, killing more and more Russian soldiers that the Ukrainians are using to kill Russian soldiers, you know, the Russians are going to do something. So, but back to the history of the European Union, because you've got to know this history, right? The gatekeeping role and policy autonomy, oh, I already covered this. Northern Italy demonstrated a critical reshaping of representation as a consequence of European Union structural funds to develop the regions of Europe. It favored non-elective officials and well-organized interest groups with relevant expertise. Okay, in Southern Italy, the Mezzogiorno, politicians remain firmly in charge but seem unable to employ the same expertise and innovation. In the United Kingdom, the European Union cohesion policy has strengthened the regional level, impacting the vertical distribution of power. It triggered the establishment of regional institutions and processes, even in centralized states. So, you know, the fact that Great Britain, United Kingdom was part of the European Union certainly played a role in encouraging Scottish regional autonomy, reestablishing the Scottish Parliament that was abolished in the early 18th century, and also, you know, creating a Welsh assembly, because that was what European Union, partly because European Union was also encouraging that. And if you're a Scottish identifier, you might love United Kingdom, but you also love Scotland. You might really be attracted to that European Union opportunities that the European Union provided to politically get what you want, even if it's short of Scotland becoming a separate independent country. The These European Union cohesion policies have also had a horizontal level impact by encouraging cross-sectoral interdependence and engagement through cohesion policy principles of partnership and programming. So if you're going to develop a poor region, you got to work with nonprofit and for-profit actors. You've got to work with different government agencies at different levels of government. So Europeanization also includes increasing linkages among other different agencies and organizations that are who you're going to work with in order to build infrastructure or whatever, increase education. Overall, a trend has strengthened towards greater domestic multi-level governance within the European Union cohesion policy, which has encouraged it. In federal states, however, like Germany, EU cohesion policies have intensified in regionalization and multi-level interactions, but they have not generated transformative effects. Whatever transformative effects means. The impact of European Union cohesion policies on political life in Central and Eastern Europe member states has been more profound than in Western Europe. In surveying Poland, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, one study found that the European Union incentives, discourses, and norms have become deeply embedded in the strategies and identities of Eastern European officials. In other words, how do you become modern? Integrate Bulgaria in the European Union. And remember, these bureaucracies in these countries, they were formed under communism. I mean, they had some tradition, obviously before communism, but Stalinist communism was brutal, authoritarian, and revolutionary. And so these civil servants have had to change their mindset. And what are you supposed to do? How are we supposed to act? Tell us what we should do. The European Union will tell you what you should do. Follow the European Union policies that your country has agreed to adopt under the French term, under the acquis communautaire, that's how you will become the new state of the post-communist era. Especially after accession to the European Union occurred, within these countries, Europeanization impacted the orientations and workloads of regional bureaucrats, the shape and size of regional structures, the regional actors' strategies, and the patterns of interaction linking societal actors to public institutions. Concurrently, a centralization within the member state of the accession process and the management of regional policies is also evident. So of course, you know, to carry out these far-reaching policy demands and changes to join the European Union, the national governments are going to play a more prominent, important role. This centralization is evident even within the EU member states with the federal system. Even in Belgium, there has been a centralization of administrative bureaucratic processes has been evident. So Belgium is notorious for being really decentralized between the Wallonia and Flanders and the other areas of Belgium. In Southeast European states, this proliferation of governance levels, which European regional policies have activated, has received confirmation. Still, the central governments remain key players as they rely on pre-existing domestic structural contexts. So in other words, Europeanization has added another layer of complexity, which is okay because we want everybody to be happy and everybody to believe that, you know, I don't simply have to look to Sophia. Sophia, please give me what I want. No. But I can go to Brussels and I can work with European actors, including European civil society organizations and groups, and I can use the new regional government in Bulgaria that the European Union insists upon to try to work with them to, So people are ideally in this worldview more able to participate and stop focusing on the will of Paris, the will of Sofia, the will of Warsaw, the will of the central government. That determines everything that happens ultimately in my life. No, 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 don't think like that. So again, the national institutions still mediate the European Union impact of the European Union policies. And that's this paradox, right? That at the same time, while you're trying to make people stop focusing so much on the national central government. You still need the power of the European nation state to harness the authority that it provides to bring about substantial, even revolutionary change in these countries. So in other words, like we talked about in this class, you want to harness Polish pride, Bulgarian pride, Greek pride with liberal values. That a proud Greek patriot is a European Greek patriot. Keep European nationalism associated with liberalism and not with authoritarianism, like nationalisms were associated with authoritarianisms in the 1930s. And of course, if you're a Ukrainian nationalist fighting against Russian imperialism and domination, you look for the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And your adversary of Russia is NATO, European Union. And NATO and European Union say they're all about, even if they're not really, but they're all about democracy and liberalism. So yes, we're fighting for democracy and liberalism, for European values. We want to join the European Union. If you are a Ukrainian nationalist, is how you will typically express that. And the European Union wants to carry out these changes in the country. So as I said, it's a dilemma or a paradox. At the same time, the European Union is attempting to make the European nation state less salient. It's still relying upon strong nation states to implement Europeanization, to implement European integration policies. And so, as I said earlier, inadvertently, it appears that for Ukrainian nationalists who want to build and make strong and stable their Ukrainian nation state, the European Union integration process has encouraged, functionally in effect, if not intentionally, the creation of a Ukrainian nation state, to move in that direction. And if you're a Russian nationalist, that's possibly going to be infuriating. That this thing, Ukraine, it's not real. Of course it is real, but we're talking about stereotypes here. Okay, so in sum, the mechanisms of representation and configuration of actors engaged in their management have demonstrated significant influence from the European Union structural funds and Europeanization in general. So again, just highlighting this mediation of the national government between European institutions and policies and local and regional policies and actors. This impact undergoes filtering by the concomitant change processes occurring at the domestic level, as well as internal mediating factors at the national and regional level to affect management and programming of structural funds. And these factors include styles of policymaking and decision-making that pre-exist European Union accession and the political and bureaucratic actors' own characteristics and attitudes. So Bulgaria is still a very centralized state, despite dividing up the country into 27 districts, to satisfy the European Union's requirements to get access to that vitally necessary structural funds. Still, they're not comparable to German Länder or Spanish autonomous communities. So another area of research in Europeanization, and keep in mind, this is focusing on the state of the field, as, you know, and again, just to highlight the importance of this, right? The people that study the European Union, they are European Union enthusiasts. Typically, they want this to work. They want this to be a successful peace strategy that brings peace and prosperity to Europe and makes Europe a leader in bringing peace and prosperity to Eurasia and the whole world. We're going to solve these conflicts that produced 2 world wars, that gave us Nazism and the Holocaust. We're going to fix Europe. And now, again, we have a war in the heart of Europe, in the same area where it was fought, much of it was fought 80 years ago. So, So again, another field of research focuses on whether, how the European Union affects the political preferences and strategies of domestic political actors within states. The European Union's impact appears to be in favor of subnational authorities seeking greater self-governing powers, but only to a limited extent. And I'm not going to get through all of this today. So you can see there's a lot here, and there's too much. But I guess maybe we'll jump to the conclusion before we go to our debate. So, no agreement exists in the research on the impact of Europeanization on the regional level. It may be due to the primacy of domestic political context in each member state and explain the different outcomes. It may also be due to the different theoretical approaches that's used in the study of subnational authorities. One approach to Europeanization's impact on subnational authorities emphasizes cognitive Europeanization, or Europeanization as socialization. It means that knowledge, practices, institutions, administrative developed in one area or time are then transferred to another area or time. That's the sharing of best practice, right? That's what that means. Actors become socialized at a European level in terms of policies and procedures and adapt these new ways of doing things to the regional level to achieve their regional goals. It is a way of Europeanizing without European legislation. And keep in mind, that if you don't have to really worry that if we can't tolerate France having so much influence and awareness and transparency in what's going on in Germany because we might have to go to war with France next year or 5 years or 10 years from now. You don't have to worry about that in the European Union. Then you're more likely to be open and transparent and learn from each other. So again, it impacts on Europeanization, impacts EU substantively in creating a regional policy level across the member states that shapes the territorial governance of the member states, even while these states all have very different regional traditions of territorial organization. Okay. So, yeah, these chapters are interesting because, at least they are for me, for a number of reasons, including the fact that each of these chapters is written by, they're not written by native speakers of English. So sometimes when you read the chapter on Greece, the way they express themselves in English is different from this chapter versus the chapter that's written by the on France by the French author. So sometimes it's evident to me the different types of English language usage that's evident in these chapters, and it's not always directly as clear to me as I might think that they could say what they need to say. I mean, it's like there's a lot of extra words in this chapter. like they didn't need as much text to say what they're trying to say, but it's still interesting. Okay, so let me shut down this because I got to open up my laptop.